Every week, she ran over my mailbox like it was her personal driveway. She was the HOA president, loud, entitled, and absolutely convinced she could do no wrong. She said it was my fault, that my mailbox stuck out too far. But after the third time she smashed it, I decided to give her something she definitely wouldn't see coming. And when her SUV hit it, the whole neighborhood heard the crunch. That was the beginning of her downfall. It started like most suburban nuisances do. Small, annoying, and easy to brush off. The first time it happened, the mailbox was leaning at a slight angle. The wooden post cracked near the base, and the box itself had a noticeable dent on the side. No note, no apology, just a mystery SUV tire tread nearby, and a busted mailbox. At first, it seemed like an accident. Could have been a delivery truck, maybe a neighbor turning too sharply. So it was replaced quietly without a fuss. But less than a week later, it happened again. This time, the entire post was snapped and lay on the grass like a broken twig. Same damage, same tire tracks, same silence. That's when the pieces started falling into place. The neighbor across the street had security cameras, and the playback showed it clear as daylight. The silver Range Rover driven by none other than Karen, the HOA president, speeding past and clipping the mailbox with her bumper. Twice. No hesitation. No pause. Just business as usual for her. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac. Mid-50s. Always dressed like she was heading to a board meeting, even if she was just walking her dog. Her Range Rover was spotless, her lawn manicured perfection, and her HOA enforcement? Ruthless. She fined a teenager down the street for hanging string lights in March. She once left a warning on a neighbor's trash because it was 3 inches out of line. And somehow, she convinced herself that everything she did was justified because it was for the good of the community. When the narrator politely approached her about the mailbox incidents, Karen didn't even flinch. She didn't deny it. She didn't apologize. She simply shrugged and said, "Well, it's kind of sticking out too far. You should probably move it back a few feet. We've had complaints." That was her explanation. According to her, the mailbox was too close to the curb, though it was installed precisely where the previous owner had it for years without issue. Her words weren't just dismissive, they were strategic, blaming the victim while positioning herself as the neighborhood's protector. Still, the narrator tried to keep the peace. He replaced the mailbox again, this time moving it back 6 inches just to be sure. It didn't matter. 10 days later, the mailbox was hit again, not just a light tap this time. The entire structure was crumpled and twisted, like it had been plowed over with intention. The tire marks were deeper, and pieces of silver paint transferred onto the wood. This wasn't negligence, it was targeted. A pattern was forming, and it wasn't just about the mailbox anymore. Karen had made it clear she didn't like to be challenged. Anyone who questioned her authority got a citation in their mailbox or fine on their doorstep. Some neighbors whispered about how she managed to get people kicked off the HOA board. Others just kept their heads down, too afraid to speak up. Over time, Karen had turned the HOA into her personal kingdom, and the mailbox had become a symbol of resistance. By this point, the narrator began to document everything. Photos, timestamps, even witness statements from passing joggers who noticed Karen's SUV near the damaged mailbox. But every time he tried to formally complain to the HOA, the responses were vague and condescending. We'll look into it. It's possible the structure wasn't up to code. You may want to double-check the HOA's guidelines on curb distance. All bureaucratic brush-offs. The board, handpicked by Karen herself, wasn't about to go against their president. What made it worse was how casual she was about it. She waved at the narrator every morning like nothing had happened. She smiled during HOA meetings while neighbors grumbled quietly under their breath. It was clear that Karen believed she was untouchable. Her confidence came not from innocence, but from knowing the rules could be bent in her favor. The mailbox wasn't the only thing she targeted. Soon after, he began receiving notices for minor violations. A patch of grass growing too long, leaving the garden hose in view, a flower pot that didn't match the approved aesthetic. It was all building up. Every petty infraction was a message. She was in control and he'd better stay in line. But what Karen didn't realize was that her smugness had finally gone too far. She thought she was chipping away at someone who would eventually give up. What she didn't expect was that those broken pieces were being gathered and used to build something stronger, something that wouldn't break so easily. The next step was logic. The narrator decided to fight fire with facts. If Karen wanted to play the rules game, then fine, he'd play it better. He pulled out the HOA bylaws, the mailbox placement ordinances, and even checked county codes. Every measurement, every placement detail, every regulation about curb distance was reviewed and cross-checked. His mailbox, according to everything he read, was perfectly compliant. Not just compliant, it was textbook. Karen had no legitimate grounds to claim it was too close or illegally positioned. Armed with this information, he filed an official complaint with the HOA. It was thorough, complete with photos of the mailbox placement, a copy of the regulations, and even a printout of the exact wording from the HOA handbook. He included a respectful but clear request that the president be held accountable for the repeated damage. At the very least, she should cover the cost of repairs. 2 weeks passed without any response. No emails, no calls, nothing. When he followed up, he received a short, automated reply. Thank you for your submission. The board will review your concern at the next monthly meeting. That was it. No action. No urgency. Just a cold delay tactic. In the meantime, things got worse. Karen began enforcing HOA policies with newfound aggression, but only on him. The narrator received multiple notices within days. One claimed that his trash bin was visible from the street for more than 30 minutes after pickup. Another stated that his lawn edging was uneven along the walkway. Then there was a violation warning because a decorative flag in his front yard had unauthorized colors. It was red, white, and blue, a simple patriotic design, but somehow it was now unapproved. It wasn't hard to see what was happening. Karen had weaponized the HOA against him. Every fine, every notice, every so-called violation was meant to frustrate and isolate him. And it was working. Some of his neighbors, who had previously waved or made small talk, began to avoid eye contact. Others seemed sympathetic, but were clearly afraid to speak out. Karen's reputation for retaliation was well known, and no one wanted to be the next target. He tried reasoning with a couple of HOA board members directly, people who didn't seem as loyal to Karen, but even they gave him the same rehearsed responses. We're just following protocol. We'll have to bring it up in a meeting. It was clear they were either scared or simply didn't want the hassle of standing up to her. The HOA had become less of a governing body and more of a private club, and Karen was sitting at the head of the table. By now, the narrator had spent over $300 repairing or replacing mailboxes. The last one had only lasted 8 days before it was knocked down again. The cycle was exhausting. The emotional toll was building too, not just from the damages, but from complete lack of support or justice. Every complaint he filed disappeared into a void. Every rule he followed was twisted into a violation. Every attempt at fairness was met with smug silence or passive hostility. What frustrated him most was the way Karen seemed to enjoy it. She never directly threatened him. She never raised her voice or made accusations. Instead, she smiled politely, sent cold HOA emails, and let her SUV do the rest. It was subtle bullying disguised as neighborhood management, and she knew exactly how to stay just under the radar. She made it all look like coincidence or miscommunication, like he was the one overreacting. But behind closed doors, Karen had built a fortress of control. The HOA board owed her favors. New residents were quickly indoctrinated into her version of community standards, and anyone who challenged her authority, especially publicly, was met with targeted enforcement, fines, and isolation. Still, the narrator refused to be intimidated. He doubled down on his documentation. He started recording video from a discreet dash cam mounted near his driveway. He stored every notice, every fine, and every HOA correspondence in labeled folders. He even got a quote from an attorney, just in case things escalated legally. He wasn't just dealing with a petty neighbor anymore. This was a slow, calculated power play. And if no one else was willing to push back, he realized he'd have to do it alone. The mailbox had become more than a wooden post. It was now a battleground, a line drawn in the gravel between someone who followed the rules and someone who thought she was the rules. And the next time Karen struck, she wouldn't be hitting the same old mailbox. That decision was already forming in his mind, and soon she was going to get exactly what she didn't see coming. The final straw came on a rainy Thursday morning. After weeks of playing defense, repairing, documenting, filing complaints, and enduring petty HOA violations, the narrator stepped outside to find the latest mailbox completely uprooted. The posts had been sheared off at the base, with splinters scattered across the wet lawn, and the metal box was flattened like a soda can. Bits of plastic and silver paint chips were embedded in the ground. It didn't take a detective to know who did it. This wasn't a soft bump or a careless mistake. It was deliberate. The impact left deep tire ruts in the soil, and the angle suggested Karen had swerved off the street just to hit it. Whether she did it out of spite or just wanted to prove a point no longer mattered, the message was clear. This wasn't about a mailbox. This was about power and the abuse of it. A neighbor 2 doors down admitted they saw Karen's Range Rover parked crooked near the property around the time of the incident, but when asked if they'd be willing to tell the HOA, they quickly declined. "I don't want to get involved," they said, echoing the same fear that kept everyone silent. That was the nature of living under her thumb. People didn't want to make waves, not when the HOA had the power to fine, harass, and shame you for something as minor as a mailbox color or a holiday wreath hung one day too long. For the narrator, something snapped. The endless cycle of fixing what she broke, defending what was already legal, and trying to reason with people who only cared about their status quo had pushed him past the point of patience. Karen wasn't going to stop unless someone made her, not with complaints, not with policies, but with something she couldn't ignore or damage. That weekend, he went to a hardware store with a plan. No more flimsy wooden posts. No more decorative mailbox kits that shattered with one hit. This time, he was going to install something stronger, something that followed every regulation, but would never fall victim to her bumper again. The idea wasn't revenge, it was survival. He wasn't going to stoop to her level. He was going to outsmart her within the rules she twisted so easily. He bought a heavy-duty steel pipe, thick enough to withstand impact and durable enough to last years. It was the kind used for highway guardrails, legal for residential use as long as it met placement standards. To anchor it, he purchased 3 bags of industrial-grade concrete mix and dug a deep base well below the frost line. Every angle, every inch of height and setback from the curb was calculated to be HOA compliant. Next came the mailbox itself. He found one made of reinforced metal with a locking door and powder coating to resist weather and tampering. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid, built like a vault compared to the standard decorative boxes most people used. The post and box were secured with tamper-proof bolts, and the whole structure was surrounded by a subtle border of river stones for aesthetics. On the surface, it looked like a clean, professional installation, but beneath it was solid steel and concrete. It wouldn't budge, not for Karen's SUV, not for anyone. He worked late at night, under the covered darkness, to avoid drawing attention. By morning, the new mailbox stood tall, quiet, unassuming, and immovable. To most people, it looked like just another mailbox. To him, it was a silent declaration, no more backing down. Over the next couple of days, he watched Karen drive by, slowing slightly each time she passed. Maybe she noticed a change. Maybe she didn't. But she didn't stop, and she didn't make a comment. For a moment, it seemed like the silent war might finally be over. But deep down, he knew her pride wouldn't let her walk away so easily. He didn't have to wait long to find out. The tension hung in the air like a thunderstorm waiting to break. Every neighbor had grown used to Karen's quiet control, her ability to intimidate without raising her voice. But now, there was a new variable she hadn't counted on. The mailbox wasn't just a stronger design. It was a line drawn in concrete. She believed she could push everyone around, and no one would dare push back. That belief was about to meet something far more unyielding than she expected. For the narrator, it wasn't about humiliation or revenge anymore. It was about restoring balance, about showing that people didn't have to live under one person's rule just because they were too afraid to speak up. The mailbox had become a symbol, not of rebellion, but of quiet resilience. The final move had been made. All that was left now was to wait for hers. The sound came early one morning, a loud metallic crunch followed by the shriek of tires skidding on asphalt. Within seconds, dogs were barking, porch lights flipped on, and curtains rustled as neighbors peeked outside to see what had just happened. At the edge of the narrator's property, Karen's silver Range Rover sat half on, half off the curb, steam hissing from the crumpled front end. The hood had buckled upward, and the front bumper was cracked, bent, and leaking fluid. Pieces of her grille lay shattered across the ground like broken glass. The mailbox stood untouched. It was still perfectly upright. Not even a scratch on the steel body. The only marks were the streaks of silver paint transferred from her SUV and a faint dent in the concrete base that hadn't even chipped. It was the mailbox's first test, and it passed with flying colors. Karen stumbled out of the vehicle, visibly shaken but more furious than hurt. She immediately began pointing at the mailbox, yelling incoherently about sabotage and property traps. Her voice was high and panicked, but even from a distance, the accusation was clear. She was trying to make it seem like this had been set up to hurt her. Several neighbors had gathered by now, watching silently. For months they had seen her act without consequence. They had watched her fine people for having slightly crooked blinds, report families for non-regulation patio furniture, and punish anyone who challenged her decisions. But this moment was different. No one rushed to her defense. No one offered support. They just watched. Karen demanded that the narrator remove the mailbox immediately, claiming it was dangerous and non-compliant. She threatened to call the police and the city inspector. She insisted that the mailbox had been deliberately constructed to damage her car, but her voice was laced with desperation, not authority. The image of her luxury SUV disabled on the side of the road next to an unscathed mailbox made it hard to argue that she was a victim. By the time a local police officer arrived, Karen had worked herself into a full-blown frenzy, but the officer remained calm. After inspecting the mailbox and hearing both sides, he asked for the HOA guidelines, which the narrator had printed and saved. Everything, placement, height, distance from the curb, type of materials, was within regulations. It was legally installed and permitted. And more importantly, the damage was a result of Karen's vehicle veering off the street and hitting private property. No charges were filed. Karen's SUV was towed from the scene. The damage was extensive enough that the vehicle couldn't be driven, and the repair bill would later climb into the thousands. Insurance was notified, but when the adjuster reviewed the situation and saw that the mailbox complied with all local and HOA regulations, the liability fell on Karen. Her premiums went up. Her pride took an even bigger hit. The incident spread through the neighborhood faster than any official notice could. People who had once been quiet now had something to talk about. And for once, it wasn't fear. It was amusement, even admiration. The man who had been Karen's primary target had managed to stop her without raising his voice, breaking a rule, or lowering himself to her level. He simply followed the rules better than she did, and let her arrogance do the rest. Some of the quieter neighbors began to speak more openly. They mentioned their own fines and petty complaints. Stories started emerging about pressure tactics, backdoor rule changes, and Karen manipulating the board to maintain control. People who had been afraid to say anything before now felt empowered. She wasn't invincible anymore. At the next HOA meeting, the energy in the room had changed. Karen tried to regain control, insisting that new regulations be added for mailbox materials. She pushed for retroactive fines and restrictions. But the board members, some of whom had grown tired of her antics, didn't follow her lead this time. When one member motioned for a vote to review her role as president, there were nods of agreement. Karen's accident had done more than damage her SUV. It had shattered the illusion of her authority. Her once loyal following now questioned her judgment. The board launched a formal review, and her past decisions were re-examined. The power she had hoarded for years began to crumble. No matter how hard she tried to spin the situation, the facts were clear. She had hit a legally installed mailbox, one she had targeted repeatedly, and her attempt to twist the story only made her look worse. The narrator never gloated. He never taunted her or threw the situation back in her face. He simply carried on with his daily life, taking care of his property, tending to his lawn, and letting the community come to its own conclusions. The mailbox stood strong, not just as a structure, but as a statement. It had become a silent reminder that people don't need to shout to be heard, and sometimes the best way to stop a bully is to let them crash into the consequences they thought would never apply to them. In the weeks following the crash, Karen's influence began to erode. The aura of control she once held over the neighborhood was no longer unquestioned. What had once been whispered complaints turned into open conversations among neighbors. People began swapping stories about unreasonably high fines, intimidation over harmless decorations, and Karen's habit of rewriting rules to suit her personal preferences. For years, she had maintained her grip through fear and silence, but now the silence was broken. The mailbox incident became something of a neighborhood turning point. No one had ever stood up to Karen and walked away with a win. But now, not only had someone stood up to her, they had done it without breaking a single rule. The quiet homeowner who had taken hits in silence had managed to protect his property, prove her wrong, and expose her for who she truly was. And that changed everything. The HOA board, which had long been stacked in her favor, started facing pressure from homeowners who were finally speaking out. A petition began circulating to hold a special meeting for a vote of no confidence in Karen's leadership. Signatures poured in. Even some of her closest allies on the board began to distance themselves, fearing the backlash now that her behavior had been exposed in such a public and embarrassing way. Karen tried to do damage control. She sent out an official HOA newsletter with a carefully worded clarification about mailbox standards, clearly aimed at defending her position. She blamed confusion over measurement guidelines and made vague references to unintended consequences. But no one was buying it. The facts were already well known. Her Range Rover had suffered thousands in damages from a perfectly legal mailbox, and everyone knew she had hit it before multiple times, without apology or accountability. Her insurance claim was denied due to her prior history of mailbox-related incidents, all of which had now been documented and reported. That meant she was left paying out of pocket for repairs. The narrator, meanwhile, received no citations, no penalties, and no demands to remove the new mailbox. In fact, several neighbors asked where he had purchased it, joking that they might need something similar, just in case. At the next HOA meeting, the tension was high. For the first time in years, the seats were packed. Homeowners who had previously avoided these meetings now showed up with copies of bylaws, lists of grievances, and a readiness to speak. Karen opened the session with her usual confident tone, but the room wasn't responding the way it used to. There were no nods of agreement, no deferential silence, just crossed arms, serious faces, and quiet murmurs of dissatisfaction. When the floor was open for comments, people didn't hold back. A retired couple spoke about being fined for planting a bird feeder that attracted too much activity. A young family recalled how Karen had sent them 3 warnings in 1 month for leaving children's toys in the yard. One homeowner even presented copies of board meeting minutes, showing how Karen had bypassed a vote to change parking rules that only benefited her own property line. Then came the motion to remove Karen from her position as HOA president, effective immediately. The vote was conducted publicly and without delay. The result wasn't even close. She was out. Karen didn't take it well. She stood up, launched into a bitter defense of her years of service, blamed newcomers for not appreciating how hard she worked, and accused others of being manipulated. But by then, no one was listening. The room had moved on. Her reign was over. After her removal, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted noticeably. People who had once been wary of speaking up now felt safe to express themselves. The HOA began revising enforcement policies to ensure fairness and transparency. Citations dropped dramatically. Board meetings became more civil, more democratic, and more focused on the needs of the entire community rather than the whims of one person. The narrator never sought revenge. He didn't ask for her removal, nor did he gloat about the outcome. All he ever wanted was to be left in peace, to protect his home from senseless damage, and to live in a neighborhood where rules applied equally to everyone. And in the end, that's exactly what he achieved. Not through anger, not through retaliation, but through quiet persistence and smart action. The mailbox, once the symbol of his frustration, now stood as a monument to resilience. It didn't just survive Karen's wrath. It helped reveal the truth about her abuses and gave the entire neighborhood the courage to reclaim their voice. What started as a petty act of destruction ended with community finally standing up for itself. And for the first time in years, the block felt like home again, not because one person ruled it, but because one person refused to be ruled. If you've ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA or a neighbor who thought the rules didn't apply to them, you know how satisfying it is when justice finally wins, quietly but powerfully. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more real-life revenge and neighborhood drama, and share your own HOA horror story in the comments below. You never know, we just might feature it next.